Imagine, if you will, an autumn afternoon on a vast estate along the Hudson River, where the turning leaves cast dappled amber light across a great stone mansion. Inside, in a nursery furnished with elegant but cold formality, a young girl sits alone by a tall window. Her name is Eleanor Roosevelt, and to the outside world she is a child of immense privilege, the niece of a president, surrounded by wealth and distinguished lineage. But within these ornate rooms, warmth is scarce. Her beautiful, distant mother, Anna Hall Roosevelt, has already begun to call her Granny for her solemn, plain-looking face, a nickname that pierces deeper than any overt cruelty. Eleanor's world is one of heavy silences, of servants who manage the daily rituals, and of a deep hunger for the affection that never quite arrives. The light shifts, and so does time. When Eleanor is just 8 years old, her mother dies of diphtheria. Not long after, her deeply loving but troubled father, Elliot Roosevelt, succumbs to alcoholism and illness. By the age of 10, she has lost both parents, and along with her younger brother, she is taken in by her maternal grandmother, Mary Hall, a woman of rigid Victorian principles. The house in Tivoli becomes a place of enforced discipline and emotional restraint, where shadows gather in long hallways and childhood spontaneity is quietly suffocated. Eleanor retreats further inward, becoming a painfully shy, awkward girl who stammers when asked a direct question and feels herself to be an outsider even at family gatherings. She often walks alone in the gardens, watching the light play on the hemlocks, finding a fragile sense of order in the natural world that eludes her indoors. Then, at 15, Eleanor is sent to Allenswood, a finishing school for young ladies in England, and here the tone of her life changes with the quality of the light, from the muted browns of a Hudson Valley parlor to the soft, dusty gold of an English classroom overlooking a gentle lawn. The headmistress, Mademoiselle Marie Sylvester, is a woman of fierce intelligence and democratic ideals, a teacher who believes that a girl's mind is a gift to be ignited, not merely decorated. Mademoiselle Sylvester discerns in Eleanor, beneath the timidity, a spark of moral clarity. She draws her out with literature and philosophy, invites her on trips to the continent, and insists that she form her own opinions and defend them aloud. The quiet girl from New York finds herself reading Racine aloud, discussing social justice, and accompanying her teacher on visits to the homes of the poor in nearby villages, where she sees for the first time how the other half truly lives. At Allenswood, daily life is structured but liberating. Mornings are given to study in a sunlit study with big windows that frame the ever-changing English sky, and afternoons to long walks on the South Downs, the chalk paths winding through wildflowers and ancient hedgerows. Eleanor begins to laugh more freely, to ride a bicycle, to make friends. In her modest room with its simple iron bed and a small writing desk, she writes long, thoughtful letters and practices articulating the thoughts that had once stayed locked inside her. Mademoiselle Sylvester's guiding principle, that true dignity lies in service to others, plants a seed that will grow for a lifetime. Eleanor later calls these years the happiest of her young life, and the gift they give her is not just education, but the profound realization that she has a voice and that it deserves to be heard. When she returns to New York to make her debut into society, she carries with her a quiet but durable confidence. The shy orphan has not been erased, but she has been reshaped. The memory of her father's tenderness, the rare bright visits when he would read poetry to her, now mingles with Mademoiselle Sylvester's insistence on intellectual courage. She understands, in a deeply personal way, that the world is full of people who feel unseen and unheard. This empathy for the underdog, ignited beside the chalk hills of England, will become the engine of her entire public life. The young woman who steps into the ballrooms of New York still feels a tremor of shyness when a room turns to look at her, but she now possesses an inner steadiness, refined in a schoolroom far from the rigid mansions of her childhood. She will need that steadiness sooner than she knows. Let us turn now to another house, set not on a crumbling English hillside, but along the broad, gracious sweep of the Hudson River at Hyde Park, New York. It is the early years of a new century, and Springwood, the Roosevelt family home, stands amid old oaks and sloping lawns, a place of clapboard and fieldstone that breathes with generations of unpretentious aristocracy. On a tender day in March 1905, a tall, slender young woman with a cascade of auburn hair marries her handsome fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in a ceremony presided over by her uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt. The day is filled with the scent of early spring lilacs, the rustle of silk, and the murmur of political admiration. To all who look on, this is a match not only of affection but of destiny, uniting two branches of a family that embodies American power. And for a time, it is happy. Eleanor dives into the life of a young matron, managing a growing household, bearing 6 children in 10 years, and learning to navigate the formidable presence of her mother-in-law, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who seems to fill even the largest rooms with her will. The house at Campobello Island, the New York townhouse, the steady rhythms of summers by the sea and winters in Albany, these form the backdrop of a marriage that, from the outside, appears complete. But inside, Eleanor wrestles with a quiet loneliness. Motherhood, though deeply felt, brings her little ease. She is uncertain with infants and often defers to nurses and to Sarah, who rules the domestic sphere with relentless assurance. The young wife finds her refuge in service, accompanying Franklin to political functions and taking on small charitable commitments. She is, nonetheless, still defined by the roles others have written for her. Then, in the autumn of 1918, the light shifts irreversibly. While Franklin is serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and recovering from pneumonia, Eleanor unpacks his things. She discovers a cache of love letters, tied with familiar care, written to Franklin by her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The revelation is devastating, a blow that shatters the very architecture of her emotional life. The quiet girl who once hungered for her father's approval now confronts the fact that her husband's heart has been lodged elsewhere. The halls of their Washington home, so recently filled with the bustle of war work, become suffocating with the weight of unspoken grief. The crisis forces a decision. Franklin's mother, Sarah, insists that divorce would be political ruin, and Lucy's Catholicism makes remarriage complicated. Eleanor, with immense pain and clear-eyed pragmatism, offers Franklin his freedom. He does not take it. They choose, instead, to remake their union. The romantic partnership is severed. From that day forward, they will live as devoted allies in a common purpose rather than as intimate husband and wife. The architecture of their life changes. Eleanor arranges for separate bedrooms, takes longer solo trips to visit friends and causes, and begins to build a world of her own making. In the smoldering aftermath of the betrayal, she discovers something unexpected, a form of liberty. Released from the exhausting demands of performing a perfect marriage, she finds she can now speak with a voice that is entirely her own, a voice that will soon be raised in public on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. This transformation is slow, almost geological in its patient accumulation. In the 1920s, while Franklin is struck by polio and wrestles with his own profound limitation, Eleanor becomes his eyes and ears, traveling the state, inspecting institutions, and returning with detailed reports. She begins to write articles, to address meetings, to advocate for the League of Women Voters and the Women's Trade Union League. What could have been the end of her emotional world becomes, instead, the quiet opening of a door. She turns a profound personal limitation, the loss of a romantic ideal and the constraints of a political marriage, into durable independence. The partnership that emerges is genuine and, in its own strange way, deeply productive. They dine together, confer on strategy, and share a mutual respect that will sustain them through the trials ahead. Eleanor learns that her public work is not an escape from her personal sorrow, but a way of giving that sorrow meaning. By the time Franklin is elected governor of New York and later president, Eleanor has already become something rare, a political wife who is not an appendage but a force. The quiet, gawky orphan who once hid in the shadows of a Hudson River mansion steps forward into the light not as a victim of betrayal, but as a woman remade. The lesson, as she would later teach without ever preaching, is that our deepest wounds contain the seeds of our greatest strengths, if only we have the courage to cultivate them in the small, daily acts of getting up, doing the work, and turning outward toward the needs of others. The winter morning light fell softly across the south portico of the White House, pale and unhurried. Inside, a fire crackled in the private study where Eleanor Roosevelt reviewed a stack of letters from desperate farmers in the Dust Bowl. The mansion, with its chandeliers and polished floors, felt worlds away from the hollow faces described in those handwritten pleas. But she had made a quiet decision. The distance would have to be closed. On this ordinary Tuesday in 1933, she began to transform the role of First Lady into something the country had never seen before, not with grand speeches, but with steady, determined listening. Her most immediate innovation was disarmingly practical. Within days of moving into the White House, she announced that she would hold regular press conferences, but only for women reporters. At the time, newsrooms were overwhelmingly male, and female journalists were often barred from serious political beats. Eleanor understood that by reserving these briefings for women, she could force news agencies to hire and retain female correspondents. Over the next 12 years, she would conduct 348 such conferences. The gatherings took place in the Treaty Room, the chairs arranged in a semicircle, the First Lady often knitting as she spoke. The topics ranged from household management to unemployment policy, always delivered in a tone of straightforward warmth. It was a quiet workplace revolution, conducted with tea and typewriters. Beyond the Capitol, she set out to become the administration's eyes and ears. At a time when a First Lady was expected to preside over receptions and flower arrangements, Eleanor crisscrossed the nation. She traveled thousands of miles by train and automobile, descending into coal mines in West Virginia, sitting in sharecroppers' cabins in the South, walking through packed tenements in New York. She would return with detailed reports for Franklin, describing the exact shade of weariness on a mother's face, the gap in a child's shoes. These were not abstract briefings, they were human testimonies. Her nickname, Eleanor Everywhere, was born from this relentless movement, a figure in a simple felt hat appearing where no president had ever set foot. In the realm of civil rights, her presence carried an even sharper charge. She quietly joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and began to publicly support anti-lynching legislation, a position that was profoundly controversial in the 1930s. When the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let the Black contralto Marian Anderson sing at Constitution Hall, Eleanor resigned her own DR membership in protest. She then helped arrange Anderson's iconic Easter Sunday concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where 75,000 people gathered under an open sky. It was a moment of luminous, dignified defiance, and it signaled that the White House could be a platform not just for power, but for conscience. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Newspapers caricatured her as a meddler, Southern politicians denounced her, and even some of Franklin's advisors grumbled about her interference. Hate mail piled up, thick envelopes filled with venom. She read them, absorbed the sting, and continued her work. There is a useful lesson in this quiet perseverance. She did not respond to anger with anger, but with an almost unshakable steadiness. She believed that the role of a public figure was to stay in the conversation, to keep showing up, to refuse to be silenced by discomfort. Her daily work was anchored by the column she wrote 6 days a week, My Day, which detailed both her official activities and her private reflections, the smell of pine on a morning walk, the sight of a Works Progress Administration mural being painted in a post office. It was a genre-defying mix of domestic detail and social commentary, read by millions. In doing so, she normalized the idea that a First Lady could have a professional voice, a public craft of her own. Her desk, cluttered with drafts and correspondence, became a quiet engine of influence. Historians often describe her as the administration's conscience, and the phrase is apartment. She could not rewrite laws with a pen or override a president's political caution, and this was a genuine limitation. The anti-lynching bill she championed never passed, blocked by powerful Senate committees. But she shifted the boundaries of what was sayable and what was thinkable in the halls of power. By the time the war clouds gathered over Europe, the First Lady was no longer a ceremonial partner. She was a moral compass, pointing steadily toward the harder questions that a nation, left alone, might prefer to avoid. The airfield in England was gray with mist as the transport plane touched down and the door opened onto a damp runway. It was the autumn of 1942, and Eleanor Roosevelt stepped out wearing the uniform of the American Red Cross, a dark wool coat buttoned against the chill. She was 58 years old, and the war had turned the world into a landscape of ruin and exhaustion. But as she walked toward the waiting ambulances, her face held that familiar expression of quiet purpose. She had come to do what only she could do, not to command troops or plan strategy, but to listen, to be present, and to carry a message of human connection across the broken ground. Her wartime travels were extraordinary in scale and risk. Over the next 3 years, she would log tens of thousands of miles, flying through dangerous airspace to visit American soldiers in England, North Africa, the Pacific Islands, and the Caribbean. She traversed makeshift airfields and makeshift hospitals with equal steadiness. On Guadalcanal, she walked through the mud in heavy boots, her Red Cross cap slightly askew, stopping at every cot to speak to a young man far from home. She wrote their names in her notebook, promised to telephone their mothers, and often did exactly that upon returning to Washington. These were not grand gestures, they were small, deliberate acts that stitched a fragile thread between the home front and the front lines. The visits to the wounded were the most emotionally demanding and the least reported. In hospital wards smelling of antiseptic and sweat, she moved slowly from bed to bed, bending close to hear whispered words. She would ask not about injuries, but about hometowns, sweethearts, and the kind of pie a soldier missed most. She sometimes held a hand for a long, silent minute. The men, many of them barely out of boyhood, saw not a First Lady in the formal sense, but a warm-eyed woman who did not flinch at the sight of bandaged stumps or burnt skin. These encounters were intensely personal, and she guarded them carefully, rarely writing about the hardest sights in her column. Parallel to her public morale missions ran a quieter, more frustrating campaign. From the earliest days of the war, Eleanor worked to persuade the administration to loosen immigration restrictions and to rescue refugees, especially Jewish children, from Nazi-occupied Europe. She met with aid organizations, corresponded with desperate relatives abroad, and pushed State Department officials to issue emergency visas. The process was grindingly slow, and the obstacles were not merely bureaucratic. There was a deep reluctance within the government, a fear of provoking isolationist sentiment, and an unspoken current of anti-Semitism that she found both maddening and heartbreaking. One episode illustrates both her determination and the painful limits of her influence. In 1940, she strongly supported the effort to bring a ship carrying nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees, the famous voyage of the St. Louis, to safety in the United States. Despite her direct appeals, permission was denied, and the ship was forced to return to Europe, where many of its passengers later perished. The failure haunted her. She did not speak of it often, but it settled into her conscience and fueled an even fiercer commitment in the years that followed. It is a sobering reminder that even the most determined advocacy can collide with walls that do not yield, and that proximity to power does not guarantee the ability to save lives. Still, she pressed on where she could. She helped publicize the work of the Emergency Rescue Committee and supported the establishment of a temporary haven for refugees in Oswego, New York. She lobbied, cajoled, and wrote, her letters piling up on diplomats' desks. Her approach was characteristically patient and shrewd. She understood that open confrontation would shut doors, so she chose persistence over protest. In this, there is a useful discipline. The willingness to work within imperfect systems while never accepting their imperfections as permanent. When the war ended, Eleanor returned to a White House that had been rewired by grief and transformation. She carried with her the faces she had seen, the soldier learning to walk on a prosthetic leg, the child refugee learning to smile again, the overworked nurse in a tropical tent. These were not photographs in a magazine, they were the lived texture of her middle years. The war had aged her, but it had also sharpened her understanding of suffering and solidarity. That understanding would soon carry her beyond the White House, onto a new stage where she would speak not just for a nation, but for all people. In the pale winter light of 1946, a solitary figure walked the quiet corridors of a converted gymnasium in Lake Success, New York. The building, hastily repurposed as a temporary home for the fledgling United Nations, hummed with the nervous energy of a world still shaking off the ashes of war. Eleanor Roosevelt, now in her early 60s, moved with a deliberate calm. Just a year removed from the White House, she had been summoned by President Truman to serve as a delegate to this new experiment in global cooperation. For a woman who had spent 12 years as America's most visible First Lady, the appointment might have seemed a natural capstone. Instead, it would become the most consequential chapter of her life. Privately, she harbored deep doubts. She had no formal diplomatic training, and the wounds of her husband's recent death still felt fresh. Yet she believed that the United Nations, for all its frailties, offered the world a second chance. When the fledgling Human Rights Commission elected her as its chair, she accepted with characteristic humility, "I shall do my best." That best would require an ocean of patience. The 18 commissioners represented wildly different legal traditions, religions, and political systems. Cold War suspicion already seeped into every discussion. The Soviet bloc insisted on collective economic rights, while Western delegates championed individual political freedoms. In the face of these fissures, Eleanor leaned not on grand speeches, but on a quiet, almost domestic form of diplomacy. Late into the night, she would host informal tea sessions in her rented apartment, inviting delegates to sit around a simple table. There, away from the glare of formal chambers, she listened more than she spoke. She coaxed the brilliant Lebanese philosopher Charles Malik and the pragmatic French jurist René Cassin to find common ground with Peng Chun-Chang, the Chinese Confucian scholar who insisted that rights be grounded in more than Western thought. Her rooms became a neutral ground where ideologies softened into conversation. This patient alchemy slowly forged a document that could speak to a Chinese farmer, a European factory worker, and an African mother alike. Meanwhile, the Berlin blockade and escalating Cold War tensions made compromise seem almost impossible, but she refused to let the process collapse. After 2 grueling years, the Commission produced a text of 30 articles. On the night of December 10, 1948, the General Assembly gathered in the Palais de Chaillot in Paris. The hall, with its great arched windows and pale stone, was bathed in the low glow of chandeliers. As the roll call proceeded, each nation's yes lifted a weight in the room. When the president announced the unanimous adoption, with 8 abstentions, delegates rose in a spontaneous ovation. All eyes turned to Eleanor Roosevelt. She stood alone at the rostrum, a spare figure in a dark dress, her gray hair pulled back, a small, tired smile on her face. She was the only woman in the room who had been applauded by a standing ovation of the entire assembly. Then she spoke words that distilled her philosophy. "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin?" she asked. "In small places, close to home, so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they're the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." The hall fell into a hushed reverence. In that moment, she had reframed human rights not as a legal abstraction, but as a moral habitat, rooted in the ordinary soil of daily life. Yet even this triumph bore a sobering limitation. The Declaration was not a binding treaty, it was a proclamation, a beacon. Governments could and would ignore it. The very nations that voted for it would soon betray its promises, and Eleanor knew that. She would spend the rest of her life reminding the powerful that a piece of paper changes nothing unless citizens hold their leaders to account. But that night in Paris, she had accomplished what many had deemed impossible. She had given humanity a common language of dignity, forged not by force, but by listening, one exhausting hour at a time. For the quiet woman who once doubted her own voice, the chairmanship had become a testament to the power of steady, everyday acts of principle. She never claimed the declaration as her own. She always called it a mosaic of many minds. But as she stepped down from the rostrum and the winter darkness of Paris closed around her, the light she had kindled in that hall would travel far beyond those walls, into the small places where justice begins. In the early morning stillness of her cottage at Balkil, the only sound was the steady click of a typewriter. Eleanor Roosevelt sat at a simple wooden desk, a wool shawl draped over her shoulders against the autumn chill. Light filtered through lace curtains, falling across stacks of letters from strangers who confided their deepest troubles. She was 70 years old, yet each day began here, fingertips striking keys, shaping the latest installment of My Day, a daily column she had started in 1935 and would continue for nearly 3 decades. This quiet ritual, repeated thousands of times, became a bridge between her inner life and the millions who read her words over breakfast tables across America. Her column was more than a chronicle of Washington society. She wrote about the asparagus in her garden, the lament of a war widow, the exhausted face of a migrant farm worker she had met on a dusty road. But within these everyday descriptions she wove quiet arguments for decency, a reminder that a nation's strength is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable. She understood that her daily presence in print was itself a form of persistent advocacy, a gentle but unwavering pressure on the public conscience. Of course, a newspaper column could not house the homeless or rewrite unjust laws. Yet it could refuse to let suffering go unnoticed, and in a society that often averted its eyes, that was not a small thing. In 1961, at the age of 77, she accepted President Kennedy's request to chair the President's Commission on the Status of Women. The appointment might have seemed ceremonial, but Eleanor approached it with the same diligence she had brought to everything. She gathered labor leaders, educators, lawyers, and activists around a long table in Washington, navigating delicate tensions between those who demanded sweeping change and those who feared upsetting traditional family structures. The Commission's final report, titled American Women, documented discrimination in stark terms and called for equal pay, affordable childcare, and an end to laws that treated women as dependents rather than citizens. It was not a revolution, but it was a foundation, precisely the sort of incremental, painstaking work that builds lasting reform. The 1950s had tested her courage in a different way. When Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to power by branding citizens as communists and destroying reputations without evidence, a climate of fear settled over the country. Many public figures stayed silent. Eleanor did not. She used her column and her public speeches to denounce McCarthy's methods, calling them a betrayal of democratic values. She argued that guilt by association and character assassination were not tools of national security but of tyranny. For this, she received hostile mail, was branded a fellow traveler, and even faced a boycott threat against her speaking engagements. Her influence could not stop McCarthyism in its tracks. The machinery of fear had too much momentum, but her voice offered a moral counterweight, reminding Americans that liberty cannot survive where conscience is silenced. Her concern for the poor never dimmed. She traveled to the coal towns of Appalachia, to urban tenements, to the arid fields of the Dust Bowl's aftermath, not as a distant observer but as a listener. She sat in cramped kitchens, held calloused hands, and asked people directly what they needed to live with dignity. Long before the phrase "war on poverty" entered the political lexicon, she was advocating for public housing, better schools, and job training programs. She knew that no single person could eradicate poverty, but she also knew that poverty thrives on invisibility. By bringing these realities into her columns and speeches, she made them harder to ignore. Her final years were marked not by retreat, but by an almost startling pace. Despite a blood disorder that sapped her energy, She kept a schedule that would have exhausted someone half her age, writing, lecturing, meeting with young civil rights activists, and hosting gatherings at Valkill where ideas were debated late into the evening. She seemed to understand that public service is not an office one holds temporarily, but a posture one carries through every ordinary day. No single speech or column of hers changed the world overnight. But the accumulation of decades of study, principled effort altered the atmosphere in which decisions were made and slowly expanded the boundaries of what was considered possible. One evening, not long before her death in 1962, she stood on the porch of her cottage as the light faded over the Hudson Valley. The hills turned soft shades of amber and blue. She might have reflected on all that remained unfinished, the inequalities not yet mended, the brutalities not yet halted. But there was also the quiet knowledge that she had never stopped showing up. She had taken the painful limitations of her own life, the griefs, the betrayals, the closed doors, and transformed them into an uncommon empathy that fueled a lifelong crusade for justice. Her example teaches that public service is a lifelong commitment, and that steady, everyday acts of principle, repeated without fanfare, can quietly reshape society.